we called it permissions in a permissionless world. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but all of us are building in public blockchains. So we are bringing that part of the permissions aspect to a permissions world. And for the audience, we started maybe like 5 years ago. Everyone can do everything. It's permissionless, and there was permission blockchain. So this was like enabled people to do stuff. But as we mature and people started to do more activities, building communities, membranes afterwards, maybe like we decided, maybe not everything, not all the time, and not everywhere. So I'm hoping we will tackle that, and I'm looking forward to hear from you and learn from you. I kind of claim identity is going to be like 2023 is the year of identity and everything identity, including there will be a reputation panel afterwards. And on this one, we'll dive into permissions. So we have all the builders in the space, almost all. I'm lucky. Thank you guys for coming over. We have Evin from Disco, Queen. Hey. Nick from Heads Protocol. Rahul from Otterspace, and Danner Drake from Badger. I'm not going to introduce you guys because all of them know. If you don't know, go check. And if you still don't know, like you can ask in the Q&A just after like we have our questions. So feel free to write your questions throughout to the chat. So, okay, Spitfire, we're kicking off. What is the most weird permission you were asked to build, if there is one?
So I wouldn't say that this is a particularly strange permission, but, or rather, I think the strangest things are the permissions that we build around every day. I think that building, ecosystems of social interaction and community that are based on our financial assets alone is a very strange practice. Like, really, we want to, divide up our social circles in accordance with who has, shared kinds of money, who has the same amount of money, who has, passes a threshold of wealth. As a requirement to participate in our social interactions. And so I think it's a really exciting time, as you note, for us to broaden the conversation around reputation and non-financial data so that we can start to curate our interactions and experiences predicated on more than just, who owns what tokens.
Yeah,
if we want to get weird,
to warm it up. Go in there, Nick. Let's warm up.
There's someone was asking us about creating an on-chain game using hats, like the different types of permissions you would need. And it's a cool design space because you like the types of things that lots of DAOs are trying to do are pretty similar. But then when you get into the gaming or like just, pure game theorist mechanism design type of, interesting, fun things, then you end up with things that you might not expect. I think we can learn a lot from game design as a way of informing what we do in our like IRL.
I love that. I think ERC 1155, which I know Hats uses as well, is like early on when I first started reading about it, I read a lot about gaming and how it was kind of structured for that. So I think that design space is super interesting and maybe a little weird. Like that's not how you think about designing an organization, but if you gamify it, it could actually be, lead to some really good outcomes.
Okay, so thinking, I'm thinking like we are doing many things on chain right now, like absurd stuff, like really future-looking stuff. There's so many things that we do, and you guys are building for different aspects of the region. So I'm gonna like ask, like, who is this for? Who is it you're building for in your kind of like audience, in your perspective? And maybe like a counter question to it, is there someone who should not look into it? Like in a way that like stay away, no permissions, and like what's your kind of like audience you're building for?
I'm happy to kick off. Hey everyone, I'm Rahul. With Otterspace, something we did differently, at least this time around, as a second-time founder for me, is that we didn't start with an idea. We started with a problem. We started with really talking to users and understanding their pain points, in particularly in the DAO space. So we were more attracted to the DAOs and the Web3 communities. Why? Because we think these are the vehicles that are responsible for building the next generation of the internet, the decentralized internet, and we want to empower them to meaningfully do so. And we want to play a role in that space. So for Otterspace, we're squarely focused on DAOs, and DAOs are very interesting because they are more like organisms, right? Like they sense and respond rather than command and execute, than command and control, for example. So they need to be empowered with different tools and to kind of execute in that manner. And that's where we see we had to unlearn a lot of things that we were used to. Not everything was skeuomorphic, and we had to translate, we had to learn, we had to adapt. To be quite honest, we are still seeing that space evolve, right? It's so what we are optimizing for example, is to learn, observe, evolve, and adapt, and we iterate. So I think I'm quite excited about the DAOs space and the community space in Web3. Even through the bull market, I think these are the best. This is the best time we see the real builders that actually that survive, strive, and cheer on. So I'm kind of like very excited for 2023 in that regard.
I definitely agree. Happy to hop in here. I think that we have hit the ceiling of fun and utility that we can coordinate around tokens. We, as in the DAO space, have gotten really good at pooling capital and spending it with our homies, and that is great. But we should be able to play other kinds of coordination games than just treasury allocation. And so, for that kind of coordination, we need to know more about one another, right? What skills do you have? Are you a performer, a designer, a token curator, a smart contract auditor? And so in order to, build a product, write a newsletter, or create an event series, or host, a conversation like we're having today in a trust minimized fashion, we need to be able to recognize, encompass, and independently verify proofs that people have contributed to these kinds of non-financial efforts. So we need to lower the switching costs of moving from one DAO to another by allowing people to be the transport layer for their own reputation, their own information, to rock up to a new squad or a new application, a new service, and be able to enjoy a personalized experience based on the parts of themselves that they want to share beyond just their token holdings. And so I think, in terms of who we can't serve right now, it is a known challenge that the nature of the decentralized data stack is not sufficient to serve people who don't yet manage their own private keys at scale. And so first, I think we need to get really good at solving problems that require account abstraction in the Web3 native ecosystem. Because if we can't get, the people on this call to use these tools, like what business do we have scaling them beyond our community? But I think, once we can sort of prove that we can add value to the DAO ecosystem and to the Web3 native squads, in the coming months, then something we can look forward to next year is sorting out, like, how do we provide more custodial but upgradable experiences?
Right.
I so love, like, Evin, how you always talk about how there's so much more to, like, being in a crypto community than, like, the financial tokens that you hold. And I think there's so much unexplored space there. We took a token approach to explore that space, which I know is different than what you guys are doing. But again, I still think that following some of these existing standards makes things really composable. So with Badger using 1155s, everything out of the box works. There's not really anything new that anyone needs to do like a specific integration for. As far as who I would say like we serve is probably operators like myself. Like, I'm not a developer. I can't really go set things up on my own. I need like a simple, click interface that I can go through and set up an organization. So I think that's who we're serving. I think that it's organizations that want to have what we call middle out management. So I think, like as Rahul said, like these organizations grow and change and evolve. And by providing all of this data in a very open way, we can, make it very easy for someone to migrate or fork an organization. So I think there is like a space that we consider a little bit more Web 2.5, a little bit different than some of what we saw this last cycle around PFP communities. It's going to be a little bit more structured. And I think that DAOs have an opportunity to take some of that structure and use that to scale.
Nick, anything you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that we're still so early in the DAO space, and the design space of decentralized organisms, centralized organizations, is really mostly unexplored. 95, 99% unexplored. You think about like Bitcoin as a DAO, you think about like Compound Governor Bravo DAOs, you think about Moloch DAOs, you think about PFP, quote unquote DAOs, and the snapshot and multi-sig version that we have so far. Like this is stuff that's like really, really, really early relative to I think where we'll end up in 5 or 10 years. So to that end, HATS is really focused on working with the people who are governance facilitators, governance nerds, like really in the weeds of breaking apart who should have what power and how do we structure an organization in an experimental way that can hopefully push forward what humans can do to coordinate with one another. And I think the way that we all win is we're using all of these different tools, all the different platforms, composing solutions for each organism in a purpose-built way, and are able to out-coordinate traditional organizations and other basically less flexible digital organisms. And that's where we're focusing all of our time at HATS right now, is like really helping people design those experiments and building the tooling to help people move faster with that type of experimentation.
Oh my God, I love that. Like all of your answers are like targeting a different part of the ecosystem, and like that helps me to thrive. And I love that like you're addressing a problem right now, but also like acknowledging it's gonna change. This is gonna look very different from in the future. One like perhaps a kind of a contra question, and I was thinking whether to ask this or not. And it might be just like a for to line out like what does all these things mean. So like 4 years ago I started from like a very different space from where we are in like corporate with blockchain and DLT, where at that time the definition was that permission blockchains and permissionless in that sense. And the way it works is that like the permissions are built into the architecture, where in the sense that people who can do stuff are because of the nature of it, like whether it's enterprise or finance or healthcare. So I'm not in that space. I'm not complaining for the last 3 years. But how do you see that, like bringing permissions onto a permissionless world versus like building with permissioned architecture from the get-go? Like, how do you see, like, what is the advantages versus, shall we just start with that?
I'd love to jump in on this one. I think that the way we've approached building Badger and other products that we're working on is kind of like a layered approach. So if you have permissionless at the base layer, then you can layer things on top of that. And as long as you kind of do that in a nuanced way and you remain unopinionated at your base layers, like there's a lot of flexibility. I think that like more in general with permissions in a permissionless world, like we need permissions to scale organizations. You have to have some sort of kind of organization and structure, and that's made possible with credentials and permissions. But there can be ways when you use in permissionless layer underneath that you can kind of earn those permissions. So you can kind of think of it as like a hybrid, or like a permissioned into permissionless into permissioned again, where you kind of graduate into a different space. And those are kind of the way that we've been thinking about it.
Love it.
Good follow up. That's an interesting question. It's kind of like it got me thinking. Like, okay, you have permission chains and non-permission chains as well, right? That's what we've been used to for the longest of time. But the thing is, I think Ethereum, for example, it being a permissionless protocol, right? Building on Ethereum, intrinsically, you carry permissionless attributes just by building on top of it. you get that for free, and that's why it's the same thing with composability and interoperability that you get with it. But I agree with Danner. I think when you have a fully permissionless protocol, right? Like it's your decision to how much permission you want to add, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a desire, and it's desire by use case. I think if you make it completely open, you're risking the potentially unexpected vectors being introduced, and that slows down perhaps unintended behaviors, right? Like as engineers, for example, we always tend to test for these really weird edge cases, which we never catch them. It's just an iterative process. So I think there is a lot of benefit in creating like a guardrail on a permissionless protocol like Ethereum, is to really extract the right incentives, and that permissions can really be your lever to extract the right incentives, so that and that way you can actually promote some interesting gamified dynamics in your network, in your protocol. So I think especially last year, we as builders, we were stuck with very few premise. I think ERC 721 is like super over optimized for pretty much anything, any use case that has a property called unique, right? And I think last year we saw the emergence of DAOs, and we saw like some of these are not applicable one-to-one, and we needed new instruments to be built. And that's why Otterspace, we started building non-transferable tokens that we call badges to express that, specifically to solve the problem of definancialization of governance, kind of moving away from one token, one vote, away from plutocratic models, and kind of more towards one human, one vote. And I think that's the really key thing. And for DAOs, permissions are necessary, permissions are desired, and I think it can be an actual catalyst for them to drive forward.
Love that. If you want to, Nick, Evin, is there something you want to say about that, or like you don't have to if you want to pass?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in, just to sort of build on the importance of bringing a broad variety of data with us to every interaction to be able to enhance more of that utility. One thing at Disco that we're really excited about right now is allowing individuals and organizations to take custody of data about themselves that already exists. So things like credit scores, proof of residency, proof of boat ownership, which is something a bot can't do, kind of esoteric, but also really helpful in terms of identifying some additional contextual information about someone. Now, of course, you don't want this data to be globally available to everybody. It's not going to be appropriate to persist on chain, because when we make something, truly permissionless, really what we mean is that it is an equal opportunity surveillance apparatus, that, we're not only giving access to Mark Zuckerberg, we're giving access to every government, every other user, every counterparty who exists. And so that can be really useful if we need data to be broadcasted in, an extremely persistent and publicly available form. But for information about ourselves, perhaps such as where we live or where we're employed, it's not going to be appropriate to, make that information readily available to the same extremely broad variety of individuals. So we get really into a fun stack of permissioned and permissionless capabilities, sort of like what Dan was saying. If we keep our sort of foundational layers unopinionated, then we can be more opinionated higher up in the stack about who gets access to what, whose qualifications or traits are going to be visible to grant them certain kinds of permissions. And so integrating both on and off chain expressions of identity, of self, can give us a really sort of granular set of experiences uniquely tailored to our preferences, but doesn't necessarily require us to dox ourselves in the process.
Love it.
Evin, you're so on point. Every time I listen to you talk, feels like my brain is melting out of my ears. I just will say that my favorite resource on this is what Spencer presented on earlier. It's just anti-capture and the possibility of having capture-resistant organisms and organizations. So I would just point to that as a resource to think about, like, why would we do this on chain at all? What's the importance of being able to make sure that we have shared custody of assets, resources, permissions, power that individuals inside the DAO or outside the DAO can't come and steal from us. That's like one of the main innovations here.
And I love that, like how you touch the different parts of the data, whether like having the choice as well as like the building up and starting from like a open space rather than like, because generally it's given, like you start with a given, someone gives that the rights. So there is like the rights are centralized in that aspect if you're opting in. So I want to ask, like, just to, in this, like in the model that you're working, so who give these permissions? Like, is this someone is like giving us and taking them away? Is it like, who makes the decisions? Is this how to say, abusable or fraudulent, or how does it work?
I could kick this one off. This is like really core to the way that we think about hats, right? It's like we're very DAO native, starting with like the governance surface of the DAO itself as the ultimate authority. We've done all this hard work to make sure that voting in the DAO, and technically speaking, that the DAO is truly decentralized. And now we get to leverage that with hats as a way to issue kind of tiers of authority. So you have this kind of delegation toward the DAO of like liquid democracy and distribution of whatever voting power, whether you're using Moloch DAO shares or tokens or one token, one vote. And then on the other side, you have this delegation away from the DAO to individual people, or small groups, pods, or smart contracts or AIs. Like that's kind of the whole point here, to become increasingly autonomous. So the idea that you can kind of have the DAO give power to a group or an individual and have that group kind of further delegate the power away from the organization will ultimately maintain that the DAO itself has ultimate revocation capacity, and is like the fail safe is really what Hats is all about.
I could follow up here. I think I agree with Nick. A lot of the values actually. So we took a slightly different approach, perhaps in our design space. We actually have a a 2-token model. One we call rafts, and the other we call badges. So a bunch of orders or a group of orders are actually called the raft. Actually, so we express organizational structures as rafts, which are traditional NFTs, and individual roles or like badges as badges. And then the reason we do this is to kind of capture identity and reputation in a non-transferable way. Stuff like this shouldn't be sold to the highest bidder. And I think that's where we are slightly opinionated when it comes to it. And then I think permissions are a great way to kind of like really lock into, especially when your identity and reputation is not transferable, right? And I think this dual token approach really helped us separate what we are trying to do for organizational structures and the individuals that belong to the DAO. And we see different access control or access level permissions also need to be expressed at the individual level versus the organizational level. The key learning, however, for us has been that there's a huge desire for distribution of influence, as we phrase it. It's not only being decentralized, but also being distributed, because most of the teams or sub-DAOs or guilds, they're bottom up. They're emergent. It doesn't start with an idea. It starts with people building, and then contributors gathering around, and then suddenly you have this a little DAO. And I think we see that in evidence, perhaps as Gnosis Safe, which spun off as a DAO, within the Gnosis ecosystem. So I think what we're trying to do is to really observe and like charge those and empower those, so that more of these things happen. And we see this being very, very grassroots and emergent. And how do we do that is to really distribute your influence and power through to the edges, through to the maximum edges of your network. And that's like that we see as perhaps a winning ingredient from our eyes, at least.
In terms of, who gets to be who gets to be defining permissions, at Disco, we think that whoever's throwing the party gets to work the door. And so what that means is that the, particular pieces of data on chain or off chain that a user brings to a given application or service interaction can be interpreted in whatever way the host of that party, the host of that experience, the creator of that application would like. There is no sort of need for us to all interpret the same input data in the same manner. The information that you bring to the table and the particular reflection of yourself that you bring to any one interaction may not be the same as another interaction. The way that you show up for Sunday brunch with your significant other's grandparents is probably going to be a little bit different than the way that you showed up at Art Basel at 4 a.m. at Space. And that's okay. We love the range. We celebrate the range. And so the unique ability to selectively disclose the parts of yourself that you would like to share, as well as the capacity for any experience, whether in person or digital, to seek different traits or qualifications, is a sort of a unique benefit of the range of how we can show up in different kinds of places. And so what this means for us in sort of the DAO and Web3 space is that we can demand a greater level of nuance from the applications and experiences that we enjoy, and we can also own and control enough sort of definition and our expression of self in our data that we can expect to not have to show up the same to every different environment.
Love that. So I'm checking our timing. We have time. I wanna just give the opportunity if there are questions. So I have like a lot in front of me because I know you guys were coming. I have questions. I have still a lot in front of me, but let's look at if the people have any questions. So what I want, like the audience, if you have, type them in the chat. I will look for them. Otherwise, we go through from here. Okay. So let's change the focus. And you guys are like playing so well, like so many different focuses from the individual's perspective to organization's perspective to the future to now. So you guys are playing very well. Let's go from the builder's perspective. Like builders so I am someone I want to implement. Like I am both in, I want to like just really enable the individual as well as the organization and make all the right things. Like, what are the considerations that I should have? Like, what do I need to think about or stay away from, if there are any?
As an end user and an individual, I think it's a really exciting time to remember that we can do so much more than push money around with our keys. That crypto is it stands for cryptography, perhaps before or in addition to standing for cryptocurrency. And so just because you get your keys from a blockchain doesn't mean you need to use them on chain. You don't necessarily need to fund your MetaMask wallet in order to do cool things with it in Web3, to take custody of and sort of self-custody assets that describe you and have value to you. So sort of from an individual perspective, I would invite all of us here today to remember to broaden our imaginations when we think about Web3 as, not just being what's surfaced on a public ledger, but really the whole universe of possibility that we open with private keys and public ledgers as part of our landscape.
I think, excuse me, I think to that, and Evin, what you were saying earlier as well, like going into things and creating situations that are unopinionated, but maybe have, as Rahul said, some guardrails to drive direction is really powerful. So, as we've gone through this process, we've tried to create a situation where anyone could come on to Badger and, deploy their own organization, get things moving. It's very simple. And the way that the data is indexed, it's very easy for anyone else to come in and, again, fork that organization or understand what's going on. So, again, creating these spaces that are very transparent, collaborative, and open to change, and then also trying to bring those guardrails in to drive direction.
I think if you're a builder right now, then there's an opportunity to go out and get lots of badges. Like there's crazy amount of speculation on all different waves. Like each wave brings its own speculations, but every day in the space is another day that you had in the space. And that means that like you got a lot more experience than many of the other people that are, joining later on. And now it's not just going to be like, oh, I've been here since 2021. I've been here since 2017. It's going to be like, show me the money, but not the money. Show me the on-chain representation of the valuable contributions that you made and the DAOs that you were a part of. And so like go stack Otterspace badges and Badger badges and V-creds that represent the work that you have done, because that's what's going to matter when DAOs develop reputation systems and start to give you power based on the actual reputation that you have, and how pro-social you are, and how trustworthy you are, how effective you are, how high leverage your knowledge is. That's like the era that I think that we're entering, and hats will use a lot of that data in order to assign people power in the right context.
I could add a little bit, slightly different take. I think as a builder, me personally being a builder as well, I think it would be, I can relate to when you approach problem solving. I think it's important to ask some key questions when you decide, what protocol or what product you end up using. For example, like we established, ID and reputation. It can't be sold to the highest bidder, right? And with identity, especially when it's not transferable, I think we need to ask the question about consent. When you have a soulbound token, where can you, if you can't transfer your reputation, ask questions. Where did it come from? Did I provide consent that I agree to this reputation, for example? And then ask questions. Can you dissociate? Can it be revoked, for example, from the issuer? And I think the answers to those questions starts to reveal some very interesting underlying principles and missions for the protocols themselves as well. And I think as a builder, it is not only your diligence, but it's also your responsibility to ask those questions, because I think we've seen this a lot, especially working in Web3. What's different about building in Web3 is there is an intrinsic ethical building that we carry. And I think these things matter. Some of the semantics do matter, I feel. So I would say, ask questions, don't challenge the status quo, and say no, say yes, just keep a critical eye and think outside the box, I think, because we are still learning. Nothing is really, I don't think we can be opinionated, because being opinionated is just a reflection of the current market, which is still evolving. So, I wouldn't trust that, for example. So yeah, that's my take.
Rahul, I think you've brought up some really thoughtful points here, right? That when we contemplate consent, does the subject of data agree with, embrace, desire to utilize a given piece of metadata written about them? So, because there is no spec for soulbound tokens, we can sort of take the conjecture that's been memed into being as modified NFTs, for which the ability to transfer has been diminished, either in its entirety or in part. And so, a reminder to everyone that Web3 wallets do not have a consent layer. Inherently in the function of our networks, any party can map any token ID to any public key they so desire. And that is the sort of fluidity and transfer of value made possible, to enable our decentralized networks and incentive systems. And so this is a feature in many ways, not a bug. However, necessarily non-transferable tokens are low assurance. They tell us very little at first blush about how they became mapped to a given public key. So it is challenging, requires a secondary level of effort and context to understand whether a token was wanted or unwanted, was earned, bought, stolen, gifted, airdropped, made from another wallet also owned by the recipient. So very low assurance in that context. And so when we think about the value that, that those kinds of mappings have, it's also important for us to think about, what are the other kinds of context that we can get from something. So for example, if we have a proof that is explicitly written about a subject, kind of like a college diploma, once it's written about you, it's always going to be written about you. That provides a different kind of assurance, an attestation versus an asset that is not specific to its subject. So anyway, I know that we're getting a little bit in the technical weeds here, talking about, the role of data subjects and the metadata they interact with. But I think, as with all things, we have a unique opportunity to experiment with a lot of different primitives. But we also need to remember that the consequences of our experiments are really, can be very significant. So if we are publishing data in a public or non-transferable form that can be used to marginalize communities, that reveals something about their gender or their race, their socioeconomic status, that can have significant consequences if we're doing so, publishing data in a form that's going to be permanent. And so, as ever, when we start to experiment with the edges of personally identifiable information, we all have an ethical imperative to, minimize the risk and harm that we bring to the table when we interact with our users.
Oh my God. Thank you. You covered that because you also covered someone's question in the panel as well. So that was on point. Don't worry at all. Like going into technical predictions, that brings me to, okay. So when someone, as you guys, like working in the field you have much more insight than us. Like us common folk, like we did it, like when you don't really discover those secrets, don't really build on it, like you have the insight. So is there anything like us common folk not seeing about like the future of where this is going? Are there any insights you could share with us, and how do you see yourself in it? Because we are like right now like issuing something and giving roles and still like a little bit like gamey. Where are we going, you think?
I think this is a tough one. Like I honestly, hopefully this doesn't sound annoying. Like I sometimes struggle to understand like my picture of where things are versus where other people, where they see things. And I think as we talked about earlier, like I think everyone in this room right now understands that the direction that we're headed and where things are going to be in a few years is very different than what we have right now. At Badger, again, I think we're really trying to like lean into that Web 2.5 space. Like we think there is kind of this transitory period. And personally, like I've been following what Disco has been doing and what Evin and her team have been pushing on. And to me, that seems like very futuristic. I'm excited to see it happen. And I feel like that's kind of a direction that I see where there's more abstraction, there's more layers. We're working with things that are on chain and off chain. I think it's gonna be awesome.
I want to push back on the premise of the question in that we are somehow more expert than anyone else in the audience. Given that the design space of decentralized organizations is 99% unexplored, I would say that there remain still 0 experts in the world on decentralized organizations. So I'll go back to what Rahul said, is like, push back, ask questions, build shit, take the tools, work them, like this is the time to do real experimentation. The best part about Web3 and the reason that DAOs are going to be so incredible is that we can all learn rapidly from each other's experimentation and fork the things that work the best and replicate them across the ecosystem to continuously stand on the shoulders of giants without having to kill each experiment along the way. So that's why I'm here. I think it's going to be an incredible next couple of years, and come help,
Nick, I think you highlight something really important, right? That usage turns specs into standards, that like the only way that we can take advantage of the permissionlessness of our base foundation is if we actually do build upon what one another bring to the table. That, permissionlessness does not mean anything unless there is composability enacted upon it. And so that's sort of a call to arms for all of us to, remember that at the end of the day, we all work in the service industry. We are building tools that serve human beings, human coordination tools, emphasis on the human part. And so, if we have the ability to come together and build things that diminish friction and add value and delight for people, who are on this call and the, people who we work with and we live with, and we have an opportunity to show how powerful these underlying technologies can be. But to the extent that they're a fetish object, a thing we talk about on panels, but we do not use on a daily basis, we still have a lot of work to do.
I love that. Thank you for dissolving my question and bringing it into a better place. I am trusting on how we are going to build in the space together. So I wanna I wanna thank you for your time. There is one more panel afterwards around another aspect of the identity before the permissions, where how we build reputations and stuff. So I want us to. So thank you, Evin, Nick, Danner, Drake, Rahul being here, and maybe like Tommy drop the link as well in the chat if people want to join and like continue the conversation on the reputation part afterwards. And thank you so much for your time.